Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at bitesizedbiographies.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 2 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Howard Hughes. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite-Sized Biographies are now available on YouTube, YouTube Music, and Spotify. And please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies. Now let's continue with our story about Howard Hughes. Hughes's obsession resulted in an announcement that he would conduct taxiing tests with the Hercules on November 1st and 2nd. He remained unspecific as to whether he would actually fly the plane, possibly to leave himself some flexibility. But because much of the committee questioning concerned skepticism as to whether he could even get off the ground, it was believed that Hughes would make every effort to prove that the Hercules could indeed fly. That the Senate subcommittee investigating him was about to reconvene in a matter of weeks was no coincidence, Hughes wishing to preempt any further criticism of his aircraft. On November 1st, with journalists from every major newspaper in the country in attendance, the dry dock that held the H-4 was flooded, and the plane actually floated for the first time. Its sheer size was staggering, 6 stories high, and a wingspan longer than a football field, with a fuselage capacity of 700 passengers, or freight weighing as much as 60 tons, approximately 100 times the size of a DC-3. Wind conditions prompted Hughes to cancel any tests until the next day, Sunday. Hughes taxied twice at 45 and 90 miles an hour, and then let reporters off of the plane, taken ashore by boat. On his next taxi test, it was expected that Hughes would merely continue to proceed without getting airborne, but as the plane picked up speed in the harbor, it suddenly lifted off to the astonishment of the thousands of people packing the shoreline. The plane reached an altitude of 70 feet and flew for about a mile before Hughes set it down without incident. A lengthy news conference ensued on shore, where Hughes evinced a great deal of confidence about the plane and its future, adding that he would be engaging in more test flights shortly. When the Senate hearings concluded at the end of November, they released a report that was highly critical of Hughes and his company, but this development was ignored. Howard Hughes's daring and dramatic flight eliminating further controversy. The plane itself was immediately towed back to a Long Beach dry dock, where a hangar had to be built around it. Hughes would never fly it again, and the Hercules remained hidden away from the public until after his death. But he refused to relinquish control of the aircraft, invoking a contractual clause that allowed him to lease the plane indefinitely. He spent over $1 million a year merely storing the Hercules, for him a great symbol of accomplishment, but also defiance of those he felt were out to discredit and even destroy him. Despite his extensive travails in getting involved in the military contracting industry, Hughes emerged from this debacle with his reputation intact, and he decided to return to the motion picture business in a big way. But instead of independent production, he chose to buy one of the big 5 of the Hollywood studios, in this case RKO. He spent $8.8 million in May of 1948 to acquire sole control of the entity, at first reassuring employees, including head of production Dor Shary, that he would allow him complete autonomy, and that no one had anything to fear over potential layoffs. Perhaps Hughes was sincere, but he rapidly changed course, Shary himself resigning in a matter of weeks, literally telling Hughes that he needed to leave before the relationship turned hostile over Hughes's constant meddling. By year's end, 700 employees, a third of the workforce, would lose their jobs. RKO gradually lost its position in the top five. Hughes insisted on applying his film production methodology to the studio's output. Predictably, he would find some tired script or story, add some titillation of some kind to generate outrage from censorship and religious organizations, delay release to build up controversy and demand, and then play the film to sell out crowds before the public realized how actually bad the film was. This was the formula that made The Outlaw continuously profitable. Hughes tried it again with Stromboli, a shallow romance starring Ingrid Bergman and directed by Roberto Rossellini. He leaked to gossip columnists what turned out to be factual rumors of an affair between Bergman and the director, both married. Hughes thought he really hit the jackpot when rumors began to circulate that Bergman was pregnant with Rossellini's child. Again, gossip that turned out to be true. But by the still puritanical American social mores of the period, such behavior was considered beyond the pale, despite the eventual marriage of the two artists. Instead of increasing patronage, the film was boycotted strenuously, also weighed down by universally terrible reviews, the result of box office disaster. Hughes lost a great deal of money, and RKO began to head into the red. Another John Wayne vehicle, Jet Pilot, was meant to emulate Hell's Angels, only with modern aircraft, but production dragged on for years, with the studio trying to build some semblance of a plot around the many hours of airplane footage, and the result featured aircraft that were practically obsolete, with a story that combined for a film called by one reviewer silly and sorry. Hughes lost millions on Jet Pilot as well. He was not above paying himself considerable amounts of money by having RKO purchase films he had produced like The Outlaw, film rights to projects, and even obsolete cameras and equipment. He also was either absent or non-responsive when important decisions needed to be made. After trying and failing to sell the studio in the early 50s, Hughes, with the company now an industry laggard, he finally unloaded it in 1955 to the General Tire and Rubber Company. RKO would never be a serious film studio again. Running RKO into the ground cost Hughes a great deal of money. However, a remarkable turnaround at Hughes Aircraft allowed him to shrug off this disaster, the company emerging as a surprisingly profitable government contractor after all. This group, led by two former Air Force generals, Ira Eaker, who Hughes knew from his days grappling with Air Force bureaucracy, and Harold George, who became Hughes Aircraft's general manager. The genius of this management team was that they focused on ancillary systems that made up the guts of the airplanes built by the much larger contractors like Lockheed and Boeing. Electronics, air-to-air missiles, and navigational control systems became their niche, and soon Hughes Aircraft was even overtaking Hughes Tool Company in revenue and profit, enough to reinterest Hughes in the operation. Inevitably, this caused a rift in the previously smooth administration. Hughes taking on both the executives and even the scientists charged with producing the innovation that transformed the company. Hughes' fundamental antagonism was driven by his desire to move much of Hughes Aircraft to Nevada, including any expansion. This was met with a literal refusal from the company's hierarchy, none of these men with any interest in moving to what was then a quirky gambling outpost in the middle of the desert. Hughes' main attraction to Nevada was his practical obsession with avoiding taxes, and unlike California, Nevada had no state income tax. Hughes had already locked horns over his California income tax, claiming he was a resident of Texas, and his presence in the state was on a temporary basis. The state pointed out his ownership of his Muirfield Road home. Hughes' response was to sell the house and live in a succession of rentals, ultimately spending most of his time in a bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel. To make it even worse, because he disliked personal confrontations, he introduced Noah Dietrich into the equation to nitpick every expense request and indiscriminately firing employees. When Dietrich relocated to Culver City, ostensibly as Hughes' overseer and hatchet man, Harold George and a number of other top executives resigned. when the entire technical and research and development engineering group threatened to resign, the federal government, Hughes Aircraft, now an indispensable contractor, interceded. Air Force cabinet members met personally with Hughes and told him if he didn't fix the dysfunction, they would pull his contracts, and they strongly hinted that he should find somebody else to manage the company. They gave him 90 days to implement a solution, which turned out to be a remarkably complicated scheme to donate Hughes Aircraft stock in 1953 to form the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Hughes also agreed to bring in a new general manager and keep an arm's length approach to management. However, Hughes remained the president of the company and the sole trustee of the Charity Medical Institute. From the beginning, the IRS fought with Hughes, as now his massive profits would become an asset of the Medical Institute, and as a charity, exempt from income tax. Initially, they refused to give the Institute charitable status, but this changed after a series of business loans Hughes made to Donald Nixon, brother of the Vice President Richard Nixon, and seemingly inexplicably, the agency changed its mind. Hughes had owned 100% of company stock, and this also addressed any employee demands for stock options, as they were now assets of the charity. Predictably, once Hughes got out of the way, Hughes Aircraft returned to stability and profitability. Up to this point in his life, Howard Hughes, even by those close to him, was perceived personally as unpredictable, irascible, indecisive, difficult, and certainly neurotic regarding personal habits. But the events of the next few years of his life would underline a fundamental, profound mental illness that became readily apparent in a succession of incidents. One of these incidents occurred on January 12, 1957. Jean Peters, like many of Hughes's actress acquaintances, was part of a frequent rotation of women that were occasionally seen with Hughes at restaurants or nightclubs in Los Angeles. The depth of any of these relationships was always a matter of conjecture, and early in January 1957, Hughes suddenly summoned 4 of his aides to a Southern California airport, and when they got there, Hughes was already there with Jean Peters. She had grown tired of Hughes's whole act, and in 1954 married a Texas oil man. That lasted about a year, and when she left her husband, Hughes renewed the relationship. Literally only weeks after her divorce was official, Hughes proposed. He nonchalantly mentioned that he and Peters were to be married, and the 4 employees would fly with them to, of all places, Tonopah, Nevada, a veritable mining ghost town in the middle of nowhere. The plane landed at a small military airstrip, and the wedding party, as it were, was conveyed to a small motel where, under assumed names, Hughes and Peters were married by a justice of the peace. There were no relatives, and Jean Peters was completely by herself. At the conclusion of the ceremony, the party flew back to Los Angeles and separate bungalows at the Beverly Hills Hotel. There has always been speculation about Hughes's motives in marrying Jean Peters, especially in such a bizarre manner. It is now believed that Hughes was not motivated romantically, but was disturbed by the possibility that Noah Dietrich was planning on having Hughes declared mentally unstable and then forcing him into a psychiatric facility. Such was the animus that now existed between the two men, stemming mostly from Dietrich's perpetual demands for some kind of stock option and Hughes's firm opposition to such compensation. As a married man, Hughes could not be committed without the legal agreement of his spouse. Before, it only took a qualified doctor, any doctor, to sign off on such a process. Hughes figured Jean Peters would never agree to such a scheme. Firing Dietrich might have seemed to be the logical solution, but Hughes had delegated so much responsibility to his second-in-command over so many administrative obligations that Hughes wanted no part of. He was very reluctant to just outright fire this longtime employee. This abruptly changed on May 12, 1957. Hughes was facing a cash flow crunch at TWA, and his solution was to have Dietrich move from the Hughes corporate office on Romaine Street to Houston to personally squeeze more money out of Hughes Tool. To discuss the details of such a move, Hughes asked Dietrich to meet with him at the Beverly Hills Hotel. But when Dietrich got there, he was moved through a series of conference rooms by a low-level staffer, Hughes claiming he wanted to avoid any wiretapping he believed present in his bungalow. In fact, Dietrich had not seen Hughes in person for a year over similar paranoia, so he shrugged off such a request as typical. Dietrich agreed that he would move to Houston under one stipulation, that Hughes agreed in writing to a compensation package that was based on the capital gain of Hughes' business portfolio. This was a maneuver to skirt Hughes' ironclad embargo on stock options. Hughes' response was predictable. Not only averse to any such agreement, he also was angered by Dietrich's aggressive posture, and his perspective was immediate. "I don't like this, Noah. You're pushing me, putting a gun to my head. Nobody puts a gun to my head." Hughes hung up the phone and then called his administrative assistant, Bill Gay, at Romaine Street, and told him to change the locks and move Dietrich off of the payroll effective immediately. That was the end of a 32-year relationship, and the two men never spoke again. For a solid year, Hughes and Jean Peters lived at the Beverly Hills Hotel almost exclusively. They communicated by phone and handwritten notes on legal pads. Hughes as unresponsive to her as he was with anyone else who desired to speak or interact with him. Their only socializing externally was an occasional screening at Goldwyn Studios. All of their meals were provided by the hotel's room service. Initially, Hughes at least ate dinner with Jean and screened films with her in his bungalow. His attitude towards Peters was underlined by his 3-month extended business trip to Canada that began in May of 1957. He was supposedly going to Canada to test pilot 2 newly designed turboprop planes for possible acquisition by TWA. But this trip was really a boondoggle to get away from his wife. Most of his time spent in his royal suite at Montreal's Ritz-Carlton Hotel. He, of course, flew in various girlfriends for trysts, even denying he was married, calling such claims yellow and false journalism. To some of these women, he even promised he would eventually marry them, an especially egregious falsehood under the circumstances. After months of this treatment, Jean Peters finally got angry enough to call Romaine and tell him that Hughes had an hour to call her, and when he did, she must have been quite convincing in her request to return to some semblance of a marriage, because Hughes agreed to meet her at Nassau in the Bahamas in a couple of days. However, in September, she returned alone to L.A. Hughes ruminated over perhaps buying the entire island of New Providence, of which Nassau was the capital. He involved a recently introduced former FBI agent and corporate fixer by the name of Robert Mayhew for this purpose. Although local politics made such a move unrealistic to begin with, it was potentially a fiasco, as nationalistic unrest was stirring among the natives who eventually would rebel from the British Crown. Hughes left in December, flying his TWA airplane back to L.A. He refused to even have dinner with his wife, and their sporadic interaction was limited. Hughes claiming that his work schedule was too demanding and intense for such formalities. Their anniversary consisted of a trip to Goldwyn Studios for a screening. Hughes subsequently became outraged when he found out that his Goldwyn screening room was being used by Otto Preminger during the day to view daily rushes of Porgy and Bess, screenings that would have been attended by some of the many black stars of the film. Hughes never set foot in Goldwyn Studios again. Instead, he relocated to a nondescript projection room on Sunset Boulevard that he rented and took control of. In July of 1958, Hughes was conveyed by his aides to this location, but at the conclusion of the evening's proceedings, instead of returning to his bungalow, he told his 3 aides/gophers that he would remain at the facility for an extended and indeterminate period. Hughes had already demanded the installation of a prodigious supply of a product he utilized all day, every day, Kleenex. He was in the habit of going through approximately 15 boxes of these tissues daily, from some of the more traditional purposes of this article all the way to insisting that his aides wrap any article given to him in the material and use it to open doorknobs to ensure no germs were left behind. Hughes himself also practicing these rituals as well. Requesting guidance from Romaine, Bill Gay would fill the power vacuum after Dietrich's firing, told them to follow Hughes' instruction to the letter, but also to provide 24-hour attention, writing up any pertinent details of their 8-hour shifts in a logbook. Thus, when Hughes spent long periods of time merely stacking and rearranging myriad Kleenex boxes, or spent hours locked in a bathroom, these activities and the time they consumed were recorded. These observations were carried out from a healthy distance, an aide only present when the occasional film was screened. Every 3 days, Hughes would have a delivery by another assistant who presented him with a paper bag that contained the identical elements: 2 Hershey bars with almonds, a 4-ounce bag of shelled pecans, and a quart of milk. The aide held the bag at a precise angle, Hughes removing each item with a fresh Kleenex. He meticulously consumed these foods over the course of the next few days, but only these foods, a diet that eventually instigated profound weight loss, dizziness, and excessive constipation, prompting even longer spells in the toilet. He also began the practice of urinating in mason jars and having this material stored in garages and hotel closets. Wearing the same shirt and pants during this time period, eventually these stained and worn items could no longer even be cleaned. When Hughes told his aides to throw them out, he then returned to his seat in the screening room completely naked, except for a handkerchief occasionally covering his groin. He refused to see his wife, only occasionally interacting by phone, telling her that he had an illness requiring hospitalization, probably still with it enough to know that his 5-inch beard and shoulder-length hair, 120-pound skeletal frame, would have not been perceived well, even by his remarkably tolerant and understanding wife. Inexplicably, after 5.5 months of this behavior, Hughes returned without a word of explanation to his bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He still refused to see his wife and descended into veritable psychosis, only able to defecate very occasionally, urinating on whatever surface was adjacent, whether that be a toilet, a floor, or even a wall. Would not bathe, shower, wash, or even dress, his handkerchief his only article of clothing. His activity consisted solely of screening films, sometimes for days at a time, while adding to an extensive manual that gave extremely explicit directions concerning such mundane activities as opening a can of fruit containing pages of required sequences. Other specifics were provided concerning the proper methodology required for opening a door, hanging a towel, lifting of a toilet seat, and so forth for dozens of such menial tasks, down to the minutest detail, all carried out with a liberal application of Kleenex included in just about every step. During this time period, Hughes surprised many of his executives within the Hughes empire by not even contacting them. His newly hired CEO of TWA, having heard of Hughes' meddling, was practically stunned when, after his employment, for 6 months he did not receive a single communication from his boss. He most likely would have been especially stunned to find out why. This time period mostly consumed by Hughes' naked self-imposed exile on Sunset Boulevard. The CEO spent almost all of his first 2 years attempting to line up investment banking financing to purchase the modern jet planes that would help TWA become an industry powerhouse. Within days of this deal being finalized, this executive, Charles Thomas, reminded Hughes that he was coming up on his 2-year anniversary, the two men having a handshake deal that if both were happy, they would negotiate a continuation of Thomas's tenure. Thomas had returned the carrier to profitability, streamlined management, and even negotiated the investment banking deal with Dillon Reed to finance the already ordered General Dynamics aircraft. Of course, as part of his new deal, Thomas wanted stock options, a fairly common practice at the time. Although deep within the throes of his mental decline, Hughes still hung on to refusing to budge on granting options. Thomas quit, and Dillon Reed exercised its change of control clause, which allowed them to walk away if TWA management changed significantly. Hughes' response was to descend into a virtual catatonic trance for a few days before calling Romaine and complaining that his bungalow had a pungent odor. The cleanup crew retained found the assignment the worst it had ever experienced in over 3 decades of operation, requiring 5 days, numerous rug shampoos, carpet replacement, fumigation, and the removal of years of built-up grime, as well as close to 50 boxes of periodicals, trash, and scrap paper. Hughes always refusing any form of housekeeping for his entire tenure. Hughes himself relocated to one of the rooms in the regular part of the hotel for the duration of his cleaning, bringing only his Barcalounger and ottoman. Presumably, he at least wore a bathrobe while traversing the hotel's public spaces. By the time Hughes assigned Robert Mayhew the task of obtaining financing, most financial institutions either turned him down or wished to impose conditions that were practically extortionate. Hughes had no choice but to accept Dillon Reed's terms. The airplane's now sitting on a runway at their manufacturing facilities, and Hughes essentially looking at a staggering lawsuit if he refused delivery. He was forced to put all of his TWA stock into a trust governed by a three-man board picked by the investment bank for the 10-year duration of the loan. He had no say as to how the airline would be run during this time period and paid extremely high fees and interest rates, the banks all more than happy to make sure that Hughes, a notoriously difficult individual to deal with, was humiliated. Hughes next decided to actually leave the Beverly Hills Hotel and move to a house, a large rental in Rancho Santa Fe near San Diego. Urban legend has it that he became enraged when the hotel tried to overcharge him $3.50 for a slice of pineapple upside-down cake. Hughes had been a customer for 13 years, at times renting as many as 8 bungalows and 10 rooms, all charged to his company at retail prices. Even in his supposed ire, he still kept 5 bungalows and 4 rooms, his autos garaged on site, and staff that normally waited on him. He would retain this environment for 7 years, despite never accessing the property again. Although Jean Peters relished her new home, which she thought her husband owned, as he had lied to her about it, Hughes locked himself away in a spare bedroom, windows permanently sealed and draped, 3 telephones installed to keep in touch with the outside world. Jean Peters was even able to include pets into her household, but even that improvement occasionally prompted the type of Hughes outburst he rained down on individuals working at the Romaine Street headquarters. When one of the pets got lost, the tycoon unloaded a lengthy harangue that was preserved on audio tape and transcript, as were all Hughes' communications. With Bill Gay out of the office, he harangued Gay's assistant, Kay Glenn. After complaining that Bill Gay had not provided anywhere near enough attention to the matter and had only assigned a cursory group of people to follow up in terms of trying to locate the animal, Hughes continued the outburst in a manner that was fairly typical and bombastic. If there was a dangerous animal escaped from some zoo or circus like a goddamn wildcat or leopard or some animal, you could be goddamn sure that they would have found it by now. I consider the loss of this particular animal and the consequences it has had to my wife to be just as important, and in the light of my resources and ability to pursue a matter of this kind, I feel that there is absolutely no reason why a search should not have been instigated for this animal equal in any way to what would have happened if some damn train had broken down here and some leopard or panther or whatnot had escaped. There is absolutely no reason why a man of my resources, and having the resources and organization that I have got, there is no goddamn reason in the world why efforts to locate this animal should not have been made equal in every way to what would have occurred if some dangerous animal had escaped in this area. In this situation here, you don't think Bill has done anything wrong going off today to pursue his social activities, whatever they may be, while this situation of complete tragedy occurs down here, and my house is likely to be broken completely asunder. You don't think that at all. You think that that is my business and my worry, and if Bill wants to go to his social affairs, that is okay, and I'm expecting too much. You repeat this, please. If you took this down in shorthand or on the tape, I wish you would repeat it wholly, the whole thing from A to Z, and it is on the tape. I hope you will play it 7 times before I never meant anything more sincerely than I mean this. And if this is the end of the road for this group, then let's wash up the other end of Romaine Street, just as we did with Dietrich. 2 days later, the house cat returned to the Hughes residence on its own. Hughes didn't last long in Rancho Santa Fe. Major plumbing issues required massive renovations, and the entourage moved to 1001 Bel Air Road, a mansion in the wealthiest enclave in Los Angeles. It was during this time period also that Hughes' longtime personal physician decided to attempt to curtail Hughes' addiction to Emperin, a powerful analgesic in pill form that combined aspirin with codeine. Believing this compound would eventually cause kidney failure, Hughes' doctor substituted codeine tablets dissolved in water and injected with a syringe, which Hughes learned to do on his own whenever he felt it necessary, another aspect that made this process ripe for abuse and addiction. Hughes also was prescribed Valium, ostensibly to help him sleep, the doctor writing numerous prescriptions in the names of aides, staffers, and other Hughes company employees to avoid any scrutiny concerning overprescribing controlled substances. His staff always knew when Hughes had just injected himself because he had the compulsive habit of singing the refrain of Lionel Hampton's hit "Hey Bop a Rebop" as he plunged the needle into some extremity, a process that also left track marks. His interactions with his wife were now limited to bi-weekly conversations in which Hughes did not even allow his wife to touch him in any way. Age restricted any access, and were also told not to look at Hughes or speak unless spoken to. Again, Hughes relying on several telephones to maintain external contact. As mentally disorganized as he was, Hughes did, through a stable of very expensive corporate attorneys, manage to combatively attempt to reestablish authority over TWA, filing lengthy litigation that eventually led to a federal court case between Hughes and the airline trustees. When the Civil Aeronautics Board turned down Hughes's gambit of paying off the loan that was the source of the trust, wisely because under the trust the airline had flourished, in May 1966, Hughes ultimately ended the protracted litigation by selling his entire stake publicly. The sale generated $566 million, second only to Ford Motor Company's first public offering in 1956. But this prompted another fundamental Hughes obsession: taxes. Hughes was outraged by even the concept of taxation, and he was advised that if he accepted the check while living in California, his tax bill would be quite expensive. Without even telling his wife, he began to think about not if, but when he would leave California. At this point, they were not even on speaking terms, and when he left in a limousine, headed to a Pasadena train station, and a set of specially chartered Pullman cars headed for Boston's Ritz-Carlton Hotel, he did not even say goodbye. For Peters, this was the final straw. When she learned from media reports where her husband was located, she got him on the phone and told him that she was coming to Boston for a chat. Although he told her not to come, she went anyway. When she got there and was led to his suite of rooms, he told her to speak to him from the doorway, as he did not want her spreading germs into the interior of the room. This only made her more adamant in the message she was about to deliver, that she had had enough, their marriage was over, and nothing he could do would change her mind. He made the usual feeble attempts at talking her out of it with promises to buy a new house where they could live together in a normal existence, but she brushed him off. He said nothing when she turned and left the room. Whatever their relationship was, it was now concluded. Perhaps Peters thought better of this ultimatum because she did nothing official and merely returned to Los Angeles. However, predictably, Hughes got bored with Boston and also figured out that Massachusetts had a state income tax as well. He then informed Robert Mayu to reassemble his custom railroad car cavalcade and that the next destination was Las Vegas. Only the Desert Inn would accede to Hughes's demand for control of the entire ninth and top floor of the hotel. So on Thanksgiving Day, the Hughes entourage checked in, of course, Hughes being conveyed on a stretcher through the service elevator. Only one three-room penthouse suite would be occupied by Hughes. The others remained empty. His aides were stationed in the living room of the suite, Hughes occupying a small bedroom off of this bullpen. His bedroom completely blacked out so that light was impenetrable. Practically deaf, Hughes had special speakers installed so that the volume of telephone calls could be rendered audible. He was fully aware that his long hair, uncut fingernails, and beard made him appear shockingly unhinged, but rather than acknowledging his bizarre appearance and even seeking help for the deep neurosis that enslaved his dysfunctional mind, Hughes instead decided that keeping the outside world completely at bay was a better solution. This indicated that Hughes was not completely divorced from reality. He knew that his appearance was shockingly inappropriate. To even close associates like Robert Mayu, he refused repeated requests for in-person meetings by even telling Mayu that if he ever laid eyes on his present appearance, Mayu would never be able to maintain the proper respect for him. Better that he perceived him as what Hughes once was, the dashing and powerful tycoon in complete control. It was only weeks into Hughes's Las Vegas residency that he ran into some issues that might affect any long-term stay at the Desert Inn. Initially pleased that Hughes would pay for an entire floor and essentially take care of himself, this attitude quickly changed when casino management realized that neither Hughes or any of his Mormon entourage gambled, the main source of Desert Inn revenue. Also, the week between Christmas and New Year's was comped to high rollers, who looked to this treatment as a major inducement to hit Vegas for the holidays. When it became clear that Hughes had no intention of leaving and let hotel middle management know in no uncertain terms, the literal owner of the hotel, a man named Morris Mo Dalitz, got involved. Dalitz was a Cleveland gangster with ties to Lucky Luciano. Most of Vegas in the mid-'60s was controlled by the literal mafia, or well-connected frontmen. When Dalitz gave the Hughes entourage the vacate or else directive, Howard Hughes got Robert Mayu involved and told him to buy the casino for cash, the ultimate power move. Normally, Hughes would have been told to get lost, but fortunately for him, one of Dalitz's partners, another Cleveland gangster named Ruby Collard, was currently fighting an extortion indictment for threatening to murder a debtor who reneged on a mutual oil exploration deal and kept Collard's initial investment. If Collard was convicted of the crime, the Desert Inn would lose its gaming license. Although Dalitz was ultimately exasperated by Hughes' negotiation style, which involved all kinds of nickel and diming, he eventually agreed to sell for $13.25 million. Collard was convicted, so the deal was probably a fortunate development for both parties, Hughes not having to get off his Barcalounger as well. Robert Mayu could be ruthlessly tough when necessary. A former FBI agent and CIA operative, he could be extremely intimidating. He proved to be worth his weight in gold to Howard Hughes when only weeks after the purchase of the Desert Inn, Mayu was approached by Johnny Roselli, a made member of La Cosa Nostra, an emissary of the Chicago mafioso who controlled much of Las Vegas. Roselli tried to tell Mayu that the Desert Inn management team would be designated by members of the outfit, but Mayu told him that not only was that not happening, but his contacts in federal law enforcement had made it clear that Las Vegas was about to be purged of criminal ties, and Roselli's friends would no longer be welcome in the state. Mayu then, as Hughes' frontman, immediately snapped up the Sands Hotel and Golf Course, the Frontier Hotel, the Castaways Hotel, and any undeveloped Las Vegas Strip frontage land that was undeveloped. When Hughes, via Mayu, started making overtures to the Stardust Hotel, the DOJ got involved to let him know that any further purchases would prompt an antitrust investigation. But all of these acquisitions were accomplished in the 12 months that Hughes arrived at the DI. Rebuffed as far as casinos, he then began buying up other properties, including the Vegas CBS affiliate, KLAS-TV. And to get a Nevada gaming license without having to make a personal appearance in front of the Gaming Commission, Hughes contacted Nevada Governor Paul Laxalt, telling him that he was interested in endowing a medical school at UNLV with an annual six-figure donation. He got his license without an appearance, and he also did make an additional casino purchase in 1968 of the Silver Slipper Casino. Politicians and businessmen alike in Vegas were thrilled to have Hughes in Nevada, his aggressive buying spree giving the city a professional appeal when it previously had an image of gangster sleaze, and it also did drive out the criminal element that previously dominated the town. Hughes' move to Las Vegas only exacerbated his mental and physical issues. In 2 years, his bedsheets were only changed 5 times. He refused dental care with a predictable effect of visible and odoriferous consequences. Although he had a personal barber on his payroll, the man only interceded when Hughes' hair was practically down his back, his fingernails so long that they began to curl. His diet had consisted for many years of a steak and canned peas served every other day, eventually supplemented by a bowl of chicken noodle soup that he would consume 1 spoonful at a time over the course of hours, frequently demanding that it be reheated, only to let it cool again, requiring another demand for reheating. His tolerance for codeine and Valium increased, and he spent much of his existence in the darkness of his room, perpetually watching television on his own station. Unusual for the time period, Hughes demanded that the station operate on a 24-hour basis, showing films he personally requested. His favorite seems to have been Ice Station Zebra, a film described by Siskel and Ebert as a dull, stupid movie, starring Rock Hudson, Ernest Borgnine, and Patrick McGoohan, a thriller that involves retrieving a Soviet satellite from the North Pole. Hughes demanded that it be shown repeatedly on KLAS late at night, the station now serving as his de facto screening room. Paul Anka recalled that while performing in Vegas, after his shows, he would go back to his room at about 2 a.m. to relax and flip on the tube, and invariably Ice Station Zebra would be on. When it ended, the station would show it again, starting at 5 a.m. If he felt like it, Hughes would call the station and have them rewind the film to repeat a section he either especially liked or wasn't paying attention to. The film rewound during a commercial break. Hughes also liked The Sting and all 5 James Bond Sean Connery efforts, and these were also routinely shown late at night. With Mayhew serving as his alter ego, Hughes was able to keep his holdings operating successfully, but, inevitably, the paranoid and irascible billionaire would become disgruntled with the man who was essentially his go-between to the universe. Mayhew was now being paid $10,000 a week with an unlimited expense account, matching Cadillacs for him and his wife, club memberships all over the West Coast, and cultivated relationships with the elite in both the business and political world. Deep down, Hughes knew Mayhew was indispensable, but unlike Bill Gay and his Mormon flunkies at Romaine, he no longer was deferential and in fact was becoming more and more confrontational. Previously, Hughes would hesitate or even refuse to make serious business decisions, and Mayhew tolerated this quirk, understanding that for Hughes, this was a power trip. But when Hughes continued to exhibit this trait with Mayhew began to push back, demanding specifics with regard to matters of finance, property acquisition, and even previously minor decisions regarding budget line items. Mayhew had previously subverted Bill Gay in the Los Angeles operation, but Gay sensed an opportunity, at first subtly and then overtly, implying that Mayhew was not only mismanaging operations, he was also embezzling money. Certain specific incidents also undermined the Mayhew-Hughes relationship. For months in 1970, Gene Peters had called Hughes repeatedly asking and then practically begging to see him. His aides dutifully forwarded the messages, but Hughes never called back. She eventually told an aide that if she didn't hear back soon, she would officially file for a divorce. At this point, the DI entourage on the 9th floor stopped communicating with her entirely. At wit's end, she contacted Mayhew in January of 1970 and told him she was going to divorce Hughes. It was left up to Mayhew to tell Hughes, and predictably, Hughes, who hadn't touched his wife in 9 years, or even seen her in 4, somehow blamed Mayhew. For years afterwards, Hughes also had private detectives living on Peters Street, following and documenting where she went and with who. This continuing even after Peters' third marriage in 1971 to a 20th Century Fox executive. The final straw for Hughes was the March 2, 1970 underground nuclear test conducted by the federal government in the Nevada desert. Hughes was terrified of such an event, with all kinds of ramifications for someone as much of a control and germ freak as Hughes. Between the potential radiation and toxic materials that might be released into his proximity, he was also enraged by Mayhew's inability to get the government to stop the test. Hughes had given both 1968 presidential candidates, Humphrey and Nixon, $100,000 in cash, and he was already angered by Richard Nixon's refusal to consult with him with regard to cabinet appointments. In fact, it was this secret payment to Nixon that prompted the attempted 1972 bugging of the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. The Nixon campaign worried that DNC chief Lawrence O'Brien, formerly on the Hughes payroll as a lobbyist in Washington, D.C., might ambush Nixon with revelations about the loan during the upcoming campaign. Although it took years to unfold, Hughes indirectly set off one of the biggest scandals in U.S. political history. To stop the nuclear testing, Mayhew first sent 2 ex-Nevada governors to D.C. to lobby on Hughes's behalf. Then he even met with Nixon himself at the Key Biscayne presidential compound, armed by Hughes with a demand that he offer Nixon $1 million in cash and a warning that he might leave the state. The bribe Mayhew was too discreet to even offer. Nixon quite pleasantly told Mayu that he would gladly personally explain the importance of the test to Hughes, and even offered to meet personally at Camp David if Hughes was so inclined. When Mayu returned, he even, possibly to maybe irritate Hughes deliberately, told him that Nixon was fully aware that Hughes lived near the testing site, but that wasn't really relevant, a clear indication that not only was Nixon not under Hughes's control, the billionaire's potential threat to leave Nevada was of no consequence. Mayu privately believed that if Hughes was serious about leaving Las Vegas, he couldn't do it without including Mayu in the preparations, Hughes a virtual prisoner of his own mental instability, having not even left his bedroom for months at a time. Mayu was wrong about that. Although Hughes did require help to get out of Las Vegas, he conspired with an aide, John Holmes, and Bill Gay to make this happen. Now, not only angry about the nuclear testing, he was also angry at America's top politician, Richard Nixon. He decided he not only would leave the state, but also the country. On the night before Thanksgiving, 1970, he was taken down the emergency exit near his room on a stretcher and clad only in a bathrobe and covered with a blanket. He was conveyed to a private jet at a military airstrip, joined by Dr. Norman Crane and a few aides. Once installed, the two pilots were allowed to enter, told that the plane was to be flown to the Bahamas and that they were not to look into or observe the passengers at any time. The Hughes penthouse, filthy and disgusting after years without any cleaning, was returned to normal. There was no historical record of what became of any urine-filled mason jars. Robert Mayu was at home, preparing for what he considered a well-deserved holiday. And the secret escape of Hughes was so flawless that the hotel security guard seated at the elevator at the opposite end of the corridor did not even notice that Hughes had left. The main driver of the Hughes plan to flee Las Vegas was to rid himself completely of Robert Mayu. To that end, he signed a proxy granting Bill Gay and two of his associates full control over his Nevada operation and instructed him to immediately terminate Mayu. Gay was so gutless that he did not do this directly. He summoned Mayu's attorney, Ed Morgan, to a meeting in L.A. at a hotel and told him that Mayu was terminated effectively immediately. When Morgan flew to Vegas to relay the message, Mayu predictably dug in his heels. It would take a court proceeding initiated by Gay to physically remove Mayu from both his office in the Frontier Hotel and eventually his company-owned mansion on the Desert Inn golf course. Mayu maintained that only Hughes could fire him, and if he did, Mayu would acquiesce. But Hughes never spoke to Mayu again, and despite a 15-year relationship where they typically spoke daily for hours, Mayu had never once met Hughes face-to-face. When Hughes's assertions that Mayu was a crook that had stolen from him eventually got into print in Life magazine, Mayu sued for $17.5 million for defamation, in addition to his $50 million wrongful termination suit. He would eventually settle in 1979 for several $million. In truth, Howard Hughes' escape from Robert Mayu ensured that he would remain a prisoner of his own design. Without his associates' constant prodding, Hughes lost any focus on business, withdrawing even further into drug addiction and isolation, and a sequence of international hotels where, encouraged by Gay and his lackeys, he spent every waking hour repeatedly watching such films as The Brain That Wouldn't Die. Hughes seemingly cast in his own real-life horror movie. The rest of the time he slept, increasing dosages of his painkillers, especially as his bed sores were so bad that one of his shoulder blades was visible through worn-away skin, Hughes' weight hovering at under 100 pounds. With the sale of Hughes Tool Corporation to raise cash in the event of Hughes having to pay massive damages over his failure to appear in the TWA case, a case that Hughes actually won on appeal, a holding company entity was formed called the Summa Corporation. And although Hughes was officially the head of the corporation, Gay had assembled a board of directors made up of his Romaine Street clique, and with Hughes in a progressively more profound stupor and health failing, Gay had essentially taken control of the Hughes empire. Hughes' apathy was underlined by a late 1971 scam that was almost ingeniously pulled off by a writer named Clifford Irving. Irving and a conspirator successfully hoodwinked McGraw-Hill into paying them $750,000 for a book entitled The Autobiography of Howard Hughes. They forged letters, and Irving claimed he had induced Hughes into giving him an extensive interview after Hughes contacted him, after supposedly being impressed by one of Irving's prior books, the Irving manuscript merely regurgitating already published information, much of it from Noah Dietrich's autobiography. Irving figured that Hughes, correctly perceived as a total recluse, would never come forward in any meaningful way, and that the fraud could stand up to any scrutiny. Initially, when told by aides of the upcoming book, Hughes didn't care, commenting that it didn't cost him anything, it was some other sucker who got taken. But Bill Gay convinced Hughes that if it became understood that Hughes met personally with some writer, but still refused to meet with any governing bodies or even appear in court, it would intensify official hostility towards him and possibly force him to appear publicly in the future, something that Hughes dreaded. On January 7, 1972, Hughes took part in a press conference via a conference call from his Bahamas location with 7 journalists, some like James Bacon, a longtime Hollywood reporter who knew Hughes personally and was able to authenticate his voice. The billionaire took questions for 2.5 hours, emphatically stating that he not only had never met Clifford Irving, but that the entire project was a complete fraud. He also laughed off any questions about his physical appearance and health and seemed surprisingly lucid. As a result, unfortunately for Clifford Irving, he and his associate would do jail time and have to make restitution, although he eventually wrote another book about the entire incident. The tremendous publicity over the Irving affair prompted the Bahamian government to become openly hostile to Hughes, the Bahamas transitioning from colonialism to a strongly nationalist culture in which wealthy white Americans would incur a negative reaction. Fearing subpoenas over several different court cases, it was decided that Hughes should not return to the United States, and he proceeded through a succession of hotel locations, always within his own created environment, although now as much of a prisoner of the Bill Gates clique as of his own broken-down mind. Managua, Nicaragua was the next stop, the country run by the utterly corrupt Somoza regime, but hospitable to Hughes. But communication facilities were primitive, and Hughes proceeded to Vancouver. However, Canadian law making any inhabitant a resident for tax purposes after 6 months of residency sent Hughes scurrying back to Managua in the summer of 1972. A horrific December 72 earthquake sent Hughes to London and the top floor of the Inn on the Park. It was in August of 1973 that Hughes, slipping on his bedroom floor, broke his hip in several places. So severe was the break that it required surgery at a hospital, the surgeon refusing to operate at the hotel. This injury prompted Hughes to require that his aides lift him, the billionaire refusing to walk from then on, even to the bathroom. Hughes had previously purchased an airline called Air West, renaming it Hughes Air West, but after the purchase, in December of 1973, the SEC indicted him, Mayhew, and other Hughes associates for criminal stock manipulation. Fearing extradition, the Hughes contingent left London for a return to the Bahamas. American fugitive Robert Vesco, already ensconced and already having influenced the government to provide residence to white-collar refugees like Howard Hughes. But Hughes quickly headed to Acapulco. Rumor has it that his doctors believed that proximity to the U.S. would continue to allow for the supply of narcotics Hughes craved in an uninterrupted fashion. The SEC charges were eventually dropped, and in wretched health, Hughes was placed on an airplane on April 5, 1976, bound for Houston, Texas, and belated emergency hospital care. Hughes died en route, age 70, his body ravaged by years of neglect, poor nutrition, and addiction. At the time of his death, his net worth was $2.5 billion, making him the world's richest man. Even in death, Hughes continued to be a source of controversy and financial upheaval. Despite despising taxes, eventually it was legally determined that Hughes died without a will. The earlier signed will having disappeared, probably destroyed, and any other future wills written after that disappeared or were left unsigned, a situation that potentially left the estate vulnerable, ironically, to massive state and federal taxes. It took 34 years to completely settle the litigation over Hughes' estate. And in that time, numerous individuals came forward claiming to be either children, wives, or even a man named Melvin Dumar, who claimed he picked up Hughes in the middle of the Utah desert and drove him back to the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, a will subsequently mysteriously appearing at the headquarters of the Mormon Church, this document leaving Melvin 1/16 of the Hughes estate. Despite a lengthy court case, this will was determined to be a fake, and the battle raged on. California and Texas accepted multi-million-dollar settlements, and the estate paid an IRS tax bill exceeding $100 million. A judge decided to split up the rest among 22 cousins of Hughes, most of whom he had never met and would have adamantly disowned. A great deal of money also went to the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, where Bill Gay and many of his minions wound up after the Hughes assets were sold off. In 1985, Hughes Aircraft was sold to General Motors, and the $5 billion proceeds also went to the Institute, making it one of the largest foundations in the world. Although she never spoke publicly about their relationship and never made any claims on the Hughes estate, Jean Peters was quoted by an acquaintance about Hughes having said, "I eventually realized that he was a sociopath, a man utterly incapable of understanding the needs of another person. He was very manipulative, even though he was just darling and charming at the same time. And even though he was affectionate in some ways and totally persuasive, it was a charade, I guess." Late in his life, Howard Hughes is alleged to have sent his ex-wife a letter saying that he had always loved her. Of course, it was delivered by one of his employees. Thank you for listening to part 2 of this podcast about Howard Hughes. Information for this podcast came from the books Howard Hughes, His Life and Madness by Donald Bartlett and James Steele, and Hughes, The Private Diaries, Letters, and Memos by Richard Hack. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at bitesizebiographies.com. Thanks for listening, and please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies.